Hi everyone. I know we have a lot of content assigned this week in terms of readings and videos, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing a formal lecture for you. What I did want to mention is the reason why there are so many readings and videos for you to look at this week is that, particularly in terms of the videos, we're going to use a lot of those cross-cultural examples time and time again. So I'm going to introduce to you, for example, the Hijra, two-spirit individuals, and the Thafafine as gender categories this week, and then we'll come back to them and refer to them in other future topics. And the second reason, probably the most important reason why we have all of these different videos and readings, is that your instructor doesn't represent or isn't a member of any of these communities. I mentioned this in our class meeting that I'm a cisgendered female, which means that I was born a biological female, and that's the gender that makes sense to me. And so my experiences and my teaching comes from my perspectives as an individual at that gender. And so one of the goals of anthropology, one of the goals of this course is to understand those different cross-cultural perspectives that we have. So clearly the most important concept for this week one topic is looking at sex and gender as not the same thing, that these terms are not used interchangeably in anthropology. They were for a while, but this is a shift we've seen in the last 10 years for sure. And so we're going to do a little exercise on Blackboard Collaborate this week where we're going to look at some of the terminology and ideas and concepts that we have that shape our understanding of sex and gender. We're going to begin by looking at it from what we call the heteronormative or the binary approach. So look at the differences between males and females. So I have a bunch of slides here that look at and define for you the differences between sex and gender from an anthropological perspective. So with sex, we have the observable physical differences and also some unobservable physical differences, because many of the slides also talk about the importance of genetics. And of course, we can't see people's genotypes. We can't see what sex chromosomes they have. That requires quite significant intervention in order to figure out what that is. And for many individuals, you'll never know what your genotype is. You'll just know what the expression or the phenotype of those traits are. Gender, on the other hand, is often what we think of when we think about our identities, right? The ways that we are perceived, evaluated, and expected to behave. Note that this also includes the ways that we are expected to think, and also it reflects the ways that we are thought about as gendered individuals. So I've given you a breakdown of the traits that we use in sex, again, from a biological perspective. And then we're going to talk about the case study of Castor Semenya, an athlete in Collaborate. So please read through some of the material that's posted here and in the notes. Our reading, one of our assigned readings this week, so Fausto Sterling 2000, looks at and examines basically intersexed individuals or intersexuality, and outlines some of the problems that we've traditionally faced when studying intersex individuals, and also just identifying that intersexuality is present in human populations. So I've given you, you'll notice that throughout my slides every week I'll post 2 tweets, screen caps of other pieces of information, of other things people have to say to contribute to the dialogue. So this was an interesting one that came up on my Twitter feed regarding how we treat human variation and how we normalize some variation. So in this case, at Queer Fox says how we normalize eye color variation, right? We don't see things as particularly abnormal, just kind of rare or unique or not as common. But with intersex variations, we do kind of pathologize them. We see them as abnormal. And so Fausto Sterling deals with this a little bit more. I've also posted a brief summary of Fausto Sterling's 1993 work, because Fausto Sterling initially wrote this piece, and then 2000, as she talks about, is kind of a reflection 7 years later on kind of an updated discourse on it. Fausto Sterling has since written another book about these concepts, and I'd really love for her to do another article update on this, because some of her ideas around 5 sexes has radically changed in the last 20 years. And you see that even between 93 and 2000, there was quite a significant change. So please do read Fausto Sterling 2000, and I posted some discussion questions below this, which will I'd like you to look at and to answer and consider as you go through your readings. Then I give you a little bit of background from biological anthropology in terms of how we approach sex estimation using the human skeleton. Note that this is something that's discussed way more at length in a course like Anthropology 209. And I also posted a link here to some really great videos where they explain this and demonstrate this for you. So I don't expect you to be able to do this, but just be familiar overall with the process that we look at. That we look at specific skeletal traits, and then based on our understanding of the variation in these populations amongst individuals of the biological sexes, of the various biological sexes, this is how we can then attempt to assign sex to individuals using their skeleton. Really, the key takeaway from this topic is this point here, that gender is something that is culturally constructed. And as the notes below say, that this isn't to state that gender isn't a very real thing that exists, that it doesn't have meaning and impact on individuals' lives, that it isn't something significant and important in our cultures, but rather it's not something that is fixed. It's not something that is permanent. It is something that different groups define differently. And really that's the takeaway of this. And throughout the term, we're gonna interrogate this a lot more thoroughly. So when people talk about the cultural construction of gender, it's much like when we talk about the cultural construction of race. It doesn't mean that it's not an important concept, but what it means is that we cannot conflate or confuse the kind of cultural constructions of how we understand things like human biological variation, be it along sexual lines or sex lines, or be it along kind of skin color or other forms of phenotypic expression, such as what we call racial classification. So it's not to say, again, that these aren't important ideas, but just we have to be really critical about how these cultural constructs reflect the biological reality and the variation that exists in humans. Okay, so I have a couple of other notes about this relating nature and nurture. Some of you might have seen in social media, there's been a lot of discourse around gender reveal parties and the problems with them. So, of course, when we talk about the biggest critique that anthropologists have about gender reveal parties is that they're not really talking about gender, are they? They're talking about something that we assign to individuals on the basis of their physical anatomy. So really what they are, sex reveal parties, is that on the basis of the genitalia that's identified in ultrasounds, individuals assign then a gender to that baby. And so there's been some really pithy responses, such as Professor Sarah Parkhack's response that really, instead of gender reveal parties, what we should have is at the critical moment, a professor from anthropology emerges and gives a lecture about how gender is a social construct, and then we all serve rainbow cake and enjoy it. Okay. So because many of us have been socialized or grew up in cultures where only two genders are our option, and these two genders reflect what is thought to be the only two sexes that exist, so male and female, we refer to this as heteronormativity. We, from a cross-cultural perspective, very quickly can see that this is not the case. And of course, in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of discourse even within Western culture around this, right? Non-binary or NB individuals are increasingly being recognized. There's a lot of conversation around this. Of course, transgender identity, all of these different topics are coming to the forefront, and probably are why many of you are taking this course. But again, as anthropologists, what we want to look at is how other cultures are also shaping this variation in terms of the identities that people have when it comes to things like gender. So I mentioned that some of the groups we're going to be looking at are two-spirit people, so I've provided a little bit of background here, and then two different film resources. And this is because, again, as a non-Indigenous person, as someone who is not two-spirited, I don't feel I can adequately represent their experiences, nor really communicate effectively the kind of variances that even exist within how people identify as two-spirited. So the first documentary, although it's a little bit older, does an excellent job of defining two-spirited people, talking a little bit about that terminology and where it comes from. Talks about the processes of colonialism that have impacted how two-spirit people identify themselves and their roles that they play in their communities. And then Trans and Native Meet the Indigenous Doctor Giving Hope features Dr. James McCocus, a McEwen alumnus, actually, who, and talking about how he's integrating traditional and Western medical practices in order to assist trans youth, particularly Indigenous trans people, right here in Edmonton, and of course adjacent to Edmonton at Enoch. Another group I'd like you to look at, and this reflects our one reading this week by Reddy and Nanda, is the Hijra. Although there's quite a bit more variation than simply just Hijra found throughout the Indian subcontinent and throughout South Asia, Southeast Asia. So I've given you a brief summary of the article, some key points here, but of course there are some questions at the back on, I think it's page 331, that are specific to the text that I'd like you to look at. We'll talk about those in our Collaborate session. These are non-required film resources, but again, to actually hear from some Hijra themselves, hear about their experiences, I've posted these 2 documentary links for you if you'd like to take a look at that. The other group that I would like us to look at as our kind of points of comparison throughout the term are the Fa'afafine. This is a term that comes from Samoa, but we see it also adopted, well, you'll see this in the video, throughout the Pacific region more generally. So this is a resource that you'll have to link through access through the McEwen website. So we have rights to access this film. So make sure you're signed into your McEwen account in order to be able to watch this film. And then I've posted some study questions about this older documentary, but I think a really excellent one looking at again a gender identity outside of the male and female binary. But because that film is older, I thought I'd show you 2 more recent ones. So first is from Pacific Beat. I quite love it. It reminds me of the old MTV days. Where it has some people from a popular kind of, I'd argue it's probably based towards youth show, talking with Fa'afafine individuals. And then Fa'afafine Samoan Boys Raised as Girls is a really interesting little mini documentary that looks at some really positive, uplifting experiences of Fa'afafine individuals, but also some of the consequences when individuals are forced to live a gender identity that is not their own. So there's a really quite sad story about a male who was raised as Fa'afafine, even though he didn't identify as such, and the consequences that came from that. So I will put a little content warning that he talks not just about bullying, but also about abuse and substance abuse in that film. And so there's some study questions for this as well. And then, of course, our summary is the key takeaways, right? That really at the end of this, it's not that you're going to have a firm definition of what sex and gender is, but start to get an idea of how we shape these differently. And then we're actually going to look more critically at sex construction and the differences that we look at to assign sex to individuals and where those models come from next topic. And then I've also given you some questions to consider more broadly that are meant to assist you in engaging with these materials. And then, of course, in terms of assessment, no, you do not have to hand in these discussion questions. These are for your own study purposes. I derive your exam questions from these review questions for the readings and stuff. So please do take a time to go through them. And of course, you can post them on the discussion board or in the course wiki as well. So have a good week, everyone, and we'll see you at our Collaborate session.